There is a moment that happens in living rooms across America every single day. Someone opens a small cardboard box, follows a set of instructions, spits into a tube, seals it, and mails it away. 6 to 8 weeks later, an email arrives. And then they open the results on their phone or their laptop and discover that the person they thought they were, the identity they had carried their entire life, the heritage they had told their children about, the ancestry they had felt proud of or curious about or connected to since childhood, is not quite what they believed, not even close in some cases. A woman in Ohio who had spent 60 years identifying as 100% Irish discovers she is 34% Ashkenazi Jewish. A man in Texas whose family had always said they were pure German finds West African ancestry that nobody ever mentioned. A retired teacher in Florida who grew up hearing stories about Cherokee great-grandmothers finds none, but discovers significant Scandinavian ancestry that she cannot place anywhere in her family's known history. A couple in Georgia who had taken the test together sits at a kitchen table staring at results that suggest they may share a common ancestor neither of them knew about. These are not rare or unusual outcomes. They are, based on the aggregate data from the tens of millions of ancestry tests that have been processed since 23andMe and AncestryDNA became household names in the early 2010s, essentially typical. The companies themselves have published data suggesting that a significant percentage of users discover ancestry components they had not anticipated. The surprises cluster in predictable ways. European Americans more commonly than expected discover Ashkenazi Jewish, Middle Eastern, or Sub-Saharan African ancestry. African Americans discover Indigenous American or unexpected European ancestry at rates that reflect the specific history of a country where official records systematically obscured the actual biological mixing that was happening. Families that considered themselves ethnically homogeneous discover they were never homogeneous at all. The average American who takes an ancestry DNA test discovers something they did not expect. Sometimes the surprise is small, a percentage point or two of something unfamiliar. Sometimes it is large enough to require a fundamental rethinking of everything they thought they knew about who they were and where they came from. A man who had built his identity around being fully Italian discovers he is 17% Sephardic Jewish. A woman who had proudly claimed English ancestry for 60 years discovers significant Scottish, Irish, and Norse components that the family story had somehow collapsed into a single vague Britishness. And every single one of those surprises has a scientific explanation, an explanation that is, once you understand it, more interesting and more human than the clean origin stories that the surprises are replacing. To understand why the results so often diverge from the family stories, you have to understand what ancestry DNA testing is actually measuring and what it is not. The tests analyze specific locations in the genome where populations have historically shown measurable differences in the frequency of particular genetic variants. By comparing your variant frequencies at thousands of these locations to reference populations whose ancestry is well documented, the algorithms can estimate what percentage of your genetic ancestry is likely to have come from specific geographic regions. This is genuinely informative. But it is also a snapshot of something that has been in constant motion for hundreds of thousands of years, and the categories the test uses: Irish, German, Ashkenazi Jewish, West African, Scandinavian, are modern geographic and cultural labels being applied to a biological reality that predates every one of those categories by tens of thousands of years. The Irish category in an ancestry test does not mean descended from people who called themselves Irish. It means carrying genetic variants whose current geographic concentration is highest in the population of Ireland, which is itself a population assembled from Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, Neolithic Anatolian farmers, Bronze Age steppe pastoralists, and Viking settlers, none of whom called themselves Irish or had any concept of Irishness. When a person who thought they were 100% Irish discovers Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry, what has actually happened is this. Somewhere in their family tree, within the past few centuries, there was a person of Ashkenazi Jewish origin, whose identity was either hidden, forgotten, or never recorded in the family's oral tradition. The hiding could have been deliberate, a response to anti-Semitism that made concealment a survival strategy. The forgetting could have been the result of the ordinary attrition of oral family history across generations, where the further back you go, the more details disappear. The non-recording was almost universal before modern documentation systems, in a world where most people had no birth certificates, no marriage records, and no paper trail connecting them to their ancestry beyond a generation or two of living memory. The DNA remembers everything that the paper trail forgot, and the family story never included. This is why the test results diverge from the family stories so consistently and so dramatically. The family stories were assembled from whatever information happened to survive into living memory, which is a tiny and unrepresentative sample of the actual biological history the DNA carries. When a man discovers West African ancestry that nobody in his family ever mentioned, there are several possible explanations, each of them a story that someone, somewhere in his lineage, decided not to tell. In the American South, where the legacy of slavery created family structures that official records systematically refused to document, the presence of African ancestry in families who identified as white is not a statistical anomaly. It is the predictable genetic consequence of a social history that enforced racial categories while simultaneously creating, through the specific violence and coercion of slavery, extensive mixing between populations that the categories were designed to keep separate. The DNA carries the truth of what happened. The family story carries what people were allowed or willing to say about what happened. These are two different records of the same events, and they almost never tell the same story with the same completeness. The Cherokee great-grandmother story is perhaps the most specifically American variant of the ancestry surprise. It appears in families across the country, particularly in the South and the Midwest, with a consistency that made researchers curious enough to investigate it systematically. What they found is that actual indigenous American ancestry in families with this story is present in some cases and absent in others, but the story itself appears at rates far higher than the genetics can support as literal truth. The Cherokee great-grandmother, researchers now believe, often served a specific cultural function. In the post-Civil War South, where racial categories were legally enforced and socially policed with tremendous intensity, claiming indigenous ancestry provided a way for families of mixed heritage to explain physical characteristics, darker complexions, certain facial features that otherwise required a different and socially dangerous explanation. The Cherokee great-grandmother was, in many cases, a story that made a biological truth speakable in a social context that would not have tolerated the actual truth. The DNA test, arriving 150 years later, finds not the Cherokee ancestry the story claimed, but sometimes finds the ancestry the story was covering for. There is a woman in North Carolina whose family had told the Cherokee great-grandmother story for as long as anyone could remember. Her ancestry test came back with a result that changed her understanding of her family's history in a way she described as simultaneously devastating and clarifying. The test showed no indigenous American ancestry. It showed significant West African ancestry. She understood, in the weeks after the results arrived, that her family had been carrying a story that protected them for generations. That the Cherokee great-grandmother had been a necessary fiction in a world where the truth her DNA told could have exposed her ancestors to violence, legal discrimination, and social destruction. The story was a lie that kept the truth alive long enough for the truth to eventually be safe to know. This is what the ancestry test is really revealing, across millions of results and millions of surprised people sitting at kitchen tables, opening emails they did not expect. It is not revealing simple truths about simple origins. It is revealing the complexity that was always there, encoded in biology, hidden by necessity, forgotten by time, simplified by the human need for a clean and manageable identity story. Every single one of the surprises has a human story behind it. A decision someone made to conceal something. A migration someone undertook and never fully explained to their children. An encounter between people that the social structures of the time had no legitimate category for. A family that survived by presenting one face to the world while carrying another in their blood. The DNA holds all of it without judgment, without the fear that motivated the concealment, without the social pressures that made the simplifications necessary. It simply carries the record forward, generation after generation, waiting for someone to develop the technology to read it and the courage to sit with what the reading reveals. You are not who you thought you were, neither is anyone else. And the distance between who we thought we were and who we actually are turns out to be, in almost every case, a more interesting and more human story than the one we were telling. The DNA is not the end of the family story. It is the beginning of the real one. The woman in Ohio who discovered she was 34% Ashkenazi Jewish spent months after her results arrived tracing her family tree backward through records she had never looked at. She eventually found what she was looking for in a marriage record from 1887, a great-great-grandmother whose maiden name had been changed when she arrived in America, a common practice among Jewish immigrants fleeing persecution in Eastern Europe. The woman's family had been Jewish, had hidden it for survival, had passed down for 4 generations a version of themselves that protected the family from anti-Semitism they had experienced in the old country and feared in the new one. The DNA test, 130 years after the concealment began, found what the concealment had been designed to hide. And the woman who found it sat with her discovery for a long time before she told her children, because she understood that she was not just learning something about herself, she was learning something about what it costs a family to survive. That cost is written in the DNA of everyone who opened a small cardboard box and found something they did not expect. The surprise is not the story. The surprise is the door to the story. And behind every door is a person who made a decision, in circumstances we can barely imagine, about what to carry forward and what to leave behind. The DNA carries it all. It always has. We just finally have the tools to read what was always there, waiting to be known.